Here's the thing about breaking points, they don't announce themselves. There's no dramatic music, no slow-motion moment where you realize it's all been too much. It's just you, standing at a kitchen sink on Christmas Eve, hands pruned from dish soap, while your daughter-in-law says something so casually cruel that your brain momentarily short-circuits. If you want to come stay with us, you'll wash the dishes. If you're watching this video, give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Now let's get to the story. I'm Rebecca. I'm 63. I raised my son alone after my husband died when Evan was 12. Heart attack at 41, just dropped dead in the driveway while taking out the trash on a Tuesday morning. One minute he was kissing me goodbye, the next I was a widow with a traumatized preteen and a mortgage I couldn't afford on a teacher's salary. But I did it. I worked double shifts tutoring on weekends, sold our second car, turned our dining room into a home office so I could grade papers at midnight. I got Evan through middle school, high school, college, and graduate school. I co-signed his student loans. I helped with his down payment on this very house, the one with the granite countertops and the wine fridge and the guest bathroom with towels that matched the soap dispenser. And there I was, 2 days before Christmas, in their $800,000 showcase, wearing the apron Kaia had shoved at me that morning with a too bright smile and a, "You don't mind, do you?" That wasn't actually a question. I'd arrived yesterday afternoon. They'd picked me up from the airport, well, Evan had, while Kaia stayed home to prep for the party. The party that was happening tonight. The party I'd apparently been volunteered to cater without being asked. This morning started at 6:30 a.m. with Kaia handing me a vegetable peeler and a 10-pound bag of potatoes. "I'm just so swamped with the ham," she'd said, already turning away. "You're a lifesaver." I peeled potatoes until my hands cramped. I set the table with the china set I'd given them as a wedding gift, the one Kaia had registered for at a store so expensive I'd had to put it on a credit card and pay it off over 6 months. I polished silver. I folded napkins into those fancy fan shapes from a YouTube tutorial Kaia had texted me at 11 p.m. the night before. And when her honey-glazed ham caught fire because she'd set the oven temperature wrong, I was the one who scraped burnt sugar off the oven racks while she stood in the doorway, scrolling through her phone, saying things like, "I just don't understand, the recipe said 375, as if the laws of thermodynamics were personally conspiring against her. My back was screaming. My knees felt like broken glass. And I was still standing at this sink, scrubbing a roasting pan crusted with her mistakes, when she walked past me, didn't even pause, and delivered that line. "If you want to come stay with us, you'll wash the dishes." Not, "Could you help?" Not, "Would you mind?" A command. A condition. As if my presence in their home during Christmas was some kind of negotiable transaction, and the price of admission was my labor. The room went silent except for the drip of the faucet. I didn't move. Didn't speak. Just stood there with soap suds sliding down my forearms, staining the sleeves of the cardigan I'd bought specifically for this trip because Kaia had mentioned she was doing a winter neutrals theme and I didn't want to clash with her aesthetic. Behind me, I heard Evan shift his weight. Here it comes, I thought. Here's where my son, my boy, the one I'd rocked through nightmares and nursed through pneumonia and driven to soccer practice in a car with a broken heater because I couldn't afford to fix it, here's where he'd step in. Where he'd say, "Kaia, come on, that's not cool," or "Mom's not our housekeeper," or literally anything that acknowledged I was a human being and not a service animal. He laughed. A short, nervous, placating chuckle. The kind of laugh that says let's all just get along and don't make this awkward, Mom, and she didn't mean it the way it sounded, "You're being too sensitive." Something inside my chest cracked. Not broke, cracked. Like ice on a lake that's been freezing for years, one cold night at a time, until finally the pressure is too much and the surface starts to splinter. This wasn't new. This wasn't even surprising. This was the culmination of 7 years of small erosions, tiny disrespects, invisible slights that I'd swallowed because I didn't want to be that mother-in-law. The difficult one. The demanding one. The one who couldn't just be grateful her son was happy. 7 years of showing up when they needed me and disappearing when they didn't. Of babysitting their kids during their anniversary trip to Hawaii while I used my vacation days. Of sending birthday gifts that never got acknowledged beyond a brief text, "Got it, thanks." Of paying their car insurance premium when Evan called in a panic about a missed payment, his voice tight with stress, saying, "Just this once, Mom, I'll pay you back," which we both knew he wouldn't. 7 years of bending myself into smaller and smaller shapes, trying to fit into the spaces they'd allow me. And now this. This casual cruelty. This assumption that my time, my energy, my body, were resources they could spend without asking. I turned off the faucet. The sudden silence felt enormous. I dried my hands slowly on the dish towel, the one with the embroidered Christmas tree that I'd sent them last year, and carefully draped it over the edge of the sink. "Excuse me," I said quietly. My voice sounded strange. Distant. Like it was coming from somewhere outside my body. "I need the restroom." Nobody responded. Kaia had already moved on, arranging cheese on a charcuterie board. Evan was refilling wine glasses, his shoulders relaxed now that the moment of tension had passed. I walked down the hallway, the one with the walls painted in that trendy grayish Kaia had insisted I help her choose 2 summers ago, spending an entire Saturday holding paint swatches up to the light while she hummed and frowned and consulted her Pinterest board. My footsteps were silent on the plush carpet they'd had installed last spring. The carpet I'd complimented effusively because that's what you do when your son is proud of something, even if you privately think it's a wildly impractical choice for a house with 2 young children. The guest bathroom door clicked shut behind me. I locked it, a small, pointless gesture of privacy in a house where I had none, and braced my hands on the vanity. The mirror was unforgiving. Bright LED lights. No soft focus. No flattering angles. The woman staring back at me looked tired. Not just physically tired, though there was that, the dark circles, the deepening lines around my mouth, the way my shoulders curved inward like I was trying to take up less space. But tired in a deeper way. Tired of trying. Tired of performing. Tired of pretending that this was what family was supposed to feel like. My hands were still damp. There was a water stain on my cardigan. A strand of hair had come loose from the bun I'd pinned up that morning, hanging limply against my cheek. I looked like someone who had been erased one favor at a time. When had it happened? When had I become invisible? When had I stopped being Rebecca, teacher, widow, mother, person, and become just a resource? A convenience? A backup plan for when their actual lives got too complicated? My phone was in my coat pocket, hanging on the back of the door. I pulled it out, hands trembling slightly. The airline app was still open from this morning when I'd checked my return flight. December 28th. For more days of this. For more days of walking on eggshells, of swallowing small humiliations, of pretending I didn't notice the way Kaia sighed when I spoke or the way Evan avoided eye contact when she was rude to me. My thumb hovered over the screen. I could modify my flight. Leave early. Claim a work emergency or a friend in crisis or just tell the truth, I can't do this anymore. But even as I thought it, I knew I wouldn't. Because that would require confrontation. It would require me to name what was happening, to make them uncomfortable, to risk being labeled dramatic or ungrateful or oversensitive. So instead, I'd stay. I'd finish washing their dishes. I'd smile through Christmas dinner. I'd play with my grandchildren and compliment Kaia's decorations and pretend that everything was fine, that I was fine, that this was all perfectly normal and acceptable. I'd go home on the 28th, and in a few months, Kaia would text asking if I could watch the kids for a long weekend, and I'd say yes. Because that's what I always did. That's who I'd become. The woman in the mirror looked back at me, and for the first time in years, I felt something besides resignation. I felt rage. Not the hot, explosive kind. The cold, clarifying kind. The kind that cuts through excuses and sees things exactly as they are. I couldn't keep doing this. I wouldn't survive it. Something had to change. I splashed cold water on my face, patted it dry with one of the decorative hand towels I wasn't technically supposed to use, and unlocked the door. When I stepped back into the hallway, I wasn't sure yet what I was going to do. But I knew, with absolute certainty, that I was done being invisible. The decision came to me in the guest bathroom, between the decorative towels and the scented candle that smelled like winter pine, but mostly just gave me a headache. I wasn't going to wait until December 28th. My hands were still shaking when I pulled out my phone, but not from fear. From something else. Something that felt dangerous and exhilarating and long overdue. I opened the airline app and scrolled past Modify Reservation. That implied I was asking permission, making adjustments to fit their schedule, their convenience, their expectations. I tapped New Booking instead. One-way ticket. Phoenix. Tomorrow morning, 6:47 a.m. The price made me wince, last-minute flights always do, but I clicked Confirm Purchase anyway. My credit card processed the charge with a cheerful chime that felt absurdly loud in the small bathroom. Done. I stared at the confirmation email for a long moment, half expecting to feel panic or regret or that familiar guilt that had governed so many of my decisions for so long. But all I felt was a strange, weightless calm. Like I'd been holding my breath for 7 years and had finally remembered how to exhale. I silenced my phone completely, not vibrate, not do not disturb, but actually off, and slipped it into my coat pocket. Then I flushed the toilet for the sake of appearances, ran the water for 30 seconds, and opened the door. The hallway was empty. From the kitchen, I could hear Kaia's voice, bright and performative, talking to someone who'd apparently arrived for the party. Evan's deeper rumble. Laughter. The clink of glasses. Nobody had noticed I'd been gone for 10 minutes. Nobody had checked on me. Nobody had wondered if I was okay. Of course they hadn't. I walked past the kitchen, past the island where my purse sat on one of the bar stools, and headed straight for the foyer. My suitcase was upstairs in the guest room, but I didn't need it. Not yet. I'd come back for it later, after they'd all gone to bed, or I'd just leave it behind entirely. It was mostly clothes I'd bought to impress Kaia anyway. Neutral colors. Expensive fabrics. Things that would photograph well in her carefully curated holiday Instagram posts. My coat was hanging by the door where I'd left it yesterday. I slipped my arms into the sleeves, the familiar weight of it settling across my shoulders like armor. Rebecca? Kaia's voice, sharp with curiosity rather than concern. I could see her in my peripheral vision, standing in the kitchen doorway with a wine glass in one hand, her head tilted in that way she had, like I was a puzzle she couldn't quite figure out but also couldn't be bothered to solve. Where are you going? I didn't turn around. Didn't explain. Didn't apologize or justify or make excuses. I just opened the front door, stepped out into the December cold, and pulled it shut behind me with a soft, decisive click. The night air hit me like a slap. Sharp and clean and so cold it made my eyes water. The porch light cast a weak yellow glow across the driveway, illuminating my rental car, a sensible sedan I'd picked up at the airport yesterday, already planning my escape even if I hadn't known it yet. I stood there for a moment, my breath fogging in front of my face, waiting to feel something. Guilt, maybe. Second thoughts. The urge to go back inside and smooth things over, to laugh it off as a misunderstanding, to be the bigger person. Nothing came. I walked to the car, my footsteps crunching on the thin layer of frost that had already formed on the grass. The street was quiet, that eerie suburban silence where everyone's inside their warm houses, living their warm lives, pretending everything's fine. Christmas lights blinked rhythmically on the house across the street. Red, green, white. Red, green, white. I unlocked the car and slid into the driver's seat. The interior smelled like rental car air freshener and stale coffee. I turned on the engine, cranked the heat, and sat there while the windshield slowly defrosted. Through the kitchen window, I could see shapes moving. Kaia, gesturing with her wine glass. Evan, probably explaining that I'd just stepped out for air, or needed a moment, or some other benign excuse that would let everyone pretend I hadn't just walked out in the middle of their Christmas Eve party. Let them wonder. I put the car in reverse and backed out of the driveway. The hotel was 15 minutes away, a mid-range chain off the highway that I'd passed on the drive from the airport. I checked in with a credit card and a fake smile, took the key card from the board desk clerk, and rode the elevator to the third floor. Room 304 was beige and anonymous and perfect. I locked the door behind me, kicked off my shoes, and sat on the edge of the bed. That's when it hit me. Not regret. Not guilt. Relief. Bone-deep, overwhelming relief. Like I'd been carrying a weight I didn't even know I had, and someone had finally cut the straps. I fell backward onto the mattress and stared at the ceiling, letting the silence wash over me. No one was asking me to do anything. No one needed me to peel vegetables or scrub pans or smile through casual cruelty. No one expected me to be smaller, quieter, more convenient. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I was alone. And it felt like freedom. I didn't sleep much that night. Instead, I made a list. Not a to-do list or a revenge list or even a particularly organized list. Just a stream of consciousness inventory of everything I'd given them over the past 7 years. Everything that had gone unacknowledged, unreciprocated, unnoticed. Babysitting, 2 weeks, June 2019, their anniversary trip to Hawaii. Used all my vacation days. Didn't get a thank you, just a text, we're back. Car insurance premium, November 2020, $847. Evan said he'd pay me back. Never did. Wedding gift, $1,200 china set. She registered for it. I paid it off over 6 months. She sent a group thank you card. Birthday gifts for the kids, every year, carefully chosen, age-appropriate, thoughtful. Never acknowledged beyond a brief text. Down payment help, $15,000. Co-signed the mortgage when the bank wouldn't approve them. They told their friends they did it all themselves. Thanksgiving hosting, 2021, cooked for 12 people, cleaned for 3 days before and after. Kaia complained the turkey was dry. Sewing Halloween costumes, 2022, spent 4 weekends making elaborate princess dresses. Kaia posted photos on Instagram, didn't tag me, didn't mention who made them. The list went on. And on. Pages of invisible labor, emotional work, financial support, time I'd never get back. I wasn't making it to guilt them or to prove anything or even to show anyone. I was making it to prove to myself that I hadn't imagined it. That the imbalance was real. That I had every right to feel used. By the time the sun started to rise, a pale, watery light filtering through the hotel curtains, I'd filled 6 pages in the notebook I kept in my purse for grocery lists and appointment reminders. 6 pages of proof that I'd been giving everything and receiving nothing. I showered, changed into the same clothes I'd worn yesterday, and checked out of the hotel at 5:30 a.m. The airport was 20 minutes away. My flight was at 6:47. I stopped at a drive-thru for coffee, terrible, burnt, perfect, and sat in the rental car return lot, sipping it slowly while I waited for the attendant to arrive. My phone was still off. I hadn't turned it on since I'd left Evan's house. There were probably messages. Voicemails. Texts asking where I was, if I was okay, when I was coming back. I didn't care. The flight attendant probably thought I was crazy when I boarded. No checked luggage, no carry-on besides my purse, wearing the same cardigan with the water stain still visible on the sleeve. But she smiled professionally and directed me to my seat, and I settled in by the window and watched the ground crew loading bags into the cargo hold. When the plane lifted into the gray December sky, I felt the distance stretch between who I had been and who I was becoming. Below me, somewhere in that maze of suburbs and shopping centers and cookie-cutter houses, my son was probably just waking up. Maybe he'd checked the guest room and found my suitcase still there, my toiletries still in the bathroom. Maybe he'd called my phone and heard it go straight to voicemail. Maybe Kaia was annoyed that the dishes were still in the sink. I didn't know. And for the first time in 7 years, their crisis wasn't mine to manage. The woman sitting next to me, a businesswoman in her 40s with a laptop bag and noise-canceling headphones, glanced at me once, then went back to her work. She had no idea she was sitting next to someone who just committed a small, quiet act of revolution. I'd left no note. No explanation. No apology. Just a damp dish towel, twisted and abandoned on the counter, and a space where I used to be. Phoenix in late December is a particular kind of beautiful, all sharp blue sky and clean desert air, the kind of brightness that feels like it could bleach away anything you wanted to forget. I picked up my rental car at the airport, another sensible sedan, this one slightly newer, and drove with no particular destination in mind. Just away. Away from the terminal, away from the highway, away from the part of the city where tourists congregated. The rental I found was on the east side, advertised online as a cozy casita with mountain views. In reality, it was a small adobe-style cottage behind someone's main house, probably built as a guest quarters or in-law suite back when people still wanted their in-laws around. But it was clean and quiet and available for a month-to-month lease, and the landlord, a woman in her 70s named Maria who didn't ask questions, handed me the keys with a warm smile and a "Welcome home, Mija." Home. The word felt strange. Like trying on a coat that used to fit but had been hanging in the closet too long. The casita was exactly what I needed: one bedroom, one bathroom, a kitchenette with a 2-burner stove, and a small living area with a ceiling fan that creaked when it turned. The furniture was minimal: a worn sofa, a wooden coffee table, a bed with a wrought iron frame. No decorative pillows. No coordinated color schemes. No signs that anyone was trying to impress anyone else. I set my purse on the counter and stood in the middle of the empty room, letting the silence settle around me like dust. No one knew I was here. No one was expecting me to be anywhere or do anything. For the first time in as long as I could remember, I was accountable to no one but myself. It should have felt terrifying. Instead, it felt like finally setting down a suitcase I'd been carrying for miles. I spent the first day doing nothing. Not productive nothing, not running errands or making plans or organizing my thoughts. Actual nothing. I sat on the small patio outside the casita, wrapped in the cardigan I still hadn't changed out of, and watched the light move across the mountains. I drank instant coffee from a mug Maria had left in the cupboard. I listened to the wind move through the palm trees. My phone stayed off. By the second day, I started to feel the edges of myself coming back into focus. Like I'd been a photograph that someone had smudged, and now the details were slowly sharpening again. I drove to a nearby shopping center and bought the basics: toiletries, a few changes of clothes from a discount store, groceries that didn't require much cooking. The checkout clerk was young, maybe 19, and she smiled at me the way you smile at a stranger, polite, brief, utterly indifferent to who I was or what I'd left behind. It was the most respectful interaction I'd had in months. On the third day, I finally turned on my phone. 43 missed calls. 68 text messages. 12 voicemails. I didn't listen to any of them. Didn't read past the preview lines that appeared on the lock screen. "Mom, where are you? This isn't funny. You left your suitcase, we're worried. Can you at least let us know you're safe?" Worried. That was interesting. Not sorry. Not we were wrong. Just worried, the kind of worry that's really annoyance dressed up in concern. I opened my email instead and composed a single message. "I'm fine. I needed space. Please don't contact me for a while." I sent it to Evan, not Kaia. Then I turned the phone off again and went back to doing nothing. The peace binder had been in my purse the whole time. I'd grabbed it the night I left the hotel, in a half-conscious moment of foresight while I was packing up to head to the airport. It was a thick leather portfolio, the kind lawyers give you when they want you to feel like your affairs are important, embossed with my late husband's initials, RMB Robert Michael Baxter. Robert had been meticulous about everything. Our taxes were always filed early. Our bills were always paid on time. When he died at 41, leaving me with a 12-year-old and a mortgage and no idea how I was going to survive, I discovered that he'd organized everything I'd need into this single binder. Life insurance policy. Bank account information. Passwords and security questions. The deed to our house. His will. And a note, in his neat handwriting, "Take care of yourself first, Becca." Always. I'd failed that instruction spectacularly. I opened the binder on the fourth day, sitting at the small wooden table in the kitchenette with a cup of coffee that had gone cold. I'd been avoiding it, not consciously, but the way you avoid looking at something you know is going to hurt. The first sections were familiar. Insurance documents I'd already processed. Bank statements from accounts I'd already closed or transferred. But toward the back, in a section labeled Estate Planning, were documents I hadn't looked at in years. Robert's will was straightforward. Everything had gone to me when he died, the house, the savings, the small investment account he'd been building. But there was a second will. A joint will, technically. The one we drafted together when Evan was born, outlining what would happen to everything when I eventually died. My fingers traced the words on the page, Robert's careful planning laid out in legal language. Primary beneficiary, Evan Christopher Baxter. Of course. That made sense. He was our only child. Who else would it go to? But then I flipped the page and found the updated documents. The ones I'd signed 7 years ago, right after Evan's wedding. The lawyer, a friend of Robert's who'd done the original estate planning, had recommended updating everything to include Kaia. Standard procedure, he'd said. Once your son is married, you'll want to make sure his spouse is included. Avoids any legal complications down the line. I'd signed without really thinking about it. Of course I wanted Kaia included. She was family now. That's what you did. You expanded the circle, you made room, you planned for the future. Primary beneficiaries, Evan Christopher Baxter and Kaia Marie Baxter, in equal shares. I stared at their names, typed in that impersonal legal font, and felt something cold settle in my chest. The house I'd worked double shifts to keep. The savings I'd scraped together teaching summer school and tutoring on weekends. The investment accounts I'd built from Robert's life insurance payout, carefully managed and grown over 16 years of widowhood. All of it, divided equally between Evan and Kaia. Not because they'd earned it. Not because they'd cared for me or supported me or even treated me with basic decency. But because that's what the paperwork said. Because 7 years ago, I'd assumed that family meant something. That love was reciprocal. That the people who inherited your life would value the person who lived it. I closed the binder and sat very still. The list came back to me then. The one I'd made in the hotel room that first night, all those invisible hours, all that unpaid labor, all those gifts and favors and sacrifices that had accumulated like compound interest on a debt that would never be repaid. I opened my notebook and started a new list. Not what I'd given them. What they'd taken. My time. My money. My dignity. My peace. My assumption that I mattered. The difference between giving and taking, I realized, isn't about the itself. It's about whether the person receiving it sees you as a human being or a resource. For 7 years, I'd been a resource. A convenience. An emergency fund that never ran dry and never asked questions. And I'd written them into my will like it was inevitable. Like they deserved it simply by existing. I thought about Robert then, really thought about him, not just the sanitized memory I'd carried for 16 years. Robert, who'd worked himself into an early grave trying to provide for us. Robert, who'd organized this binder so carefully, who'd written "Take care of yourself first" because he knew, that I wouldn't. He'd left me everything so I could build a life. Not so I could subsidize Evan's mortgage or fund Kaia's kitchen renovations or pay for vacations I wasn't invited on. So I could live. I opened the binder again and read through every page. Not skimming. Really reading. Understanding what I had, what I controlled, what was actually mine to decide. The house, paid off. Worth maybe $400,000 in the current market. The investment accounts, carefully grown. Just over $380,000. The savings, modest but stable. $45,000. The life insurance policy I'd taken out on myself 5 years ago. $250,000. All told, just over $1 million. Not a fortune, but enough. Enough to live comfortably for the rest of my life if I was careful. Enough to travel, to donate to causes I cared about, to leave a legacy that actually meant something. Enough to matter. And right now, all of it was slated to go to 2 people who couldn't even be bothered to thank me for washing their dishes. I pulled out a pen, a blue ballpoint, nothing fancy, and drew a careful line through one of the clauses. Not crossing it out. Just marking it. Highlighting it for review. Primary beneficiaries, Evan Christopher Baxter and Kaia Marie Baxter, in equal shares. I wasn't making decisions yet. I wasn't acting out of anger or spite or revenge. But I was done making decisions out of guilt, obligation, or the fear of seeming difficult. The sun was setting outside, painting the mountains in shades of amber and rose. I made fresh coffee, sat back down at the table, and kept reading. For the first time in years, I was planning my future instead of funding someone else's. And it felt like coming home. The idea came to me on day 7, while I was drinking coffee on the patio and watching a roadrunner hunt for lizards in the gravel. I'd been thinking about the redacted trust all morning, specifically, about the fact that Evan and Kaia had no idea what was in it. They'd never asked. Never wondered what Robert had left behind, what I'd built in the 16 years since his death, what might eventually become theirs simply because they existed. They just assumed. The way you assume the sun will rise or the faucet will run or your mother-in-law will always be available to solve your problems. Assumption is a kind of entitlement. And entitlement, I'd learned, only grows when it's left unchallenged. I went inside, opened my laptop, a basic model I'd bought at a big box store on day 3, and searched for the nearest FedEx office. Then I pulled out the piece binder and carefully removed the most recent trust documents. 23 pages of legal language, signatures, notary stamps, and beneficiary designations. I didn't make copies yet. First, I needed to decide what they'd see. The redaction took longer than I expected. I sat at the wooden table with a thick black marker and went through every page, line by line, blacking out anything that revealed specifics. Account numbers. Property values. The exact breakdown of assets. And, most importantly, the names of the beneficiaries. Where it said primary beneficiaries, Evan Christopher Baxter and Kaia Marie Baxter, in equal shares, I drew a careful black rectangle, thick enough that no light could penetrate it, no hint of the letters beneath. What remained was a skeleton. The structure of the trust without its substance. Proof that it existed, that it was substantial, that decisions had been made, but no clarity about what those decisions were or who they benefited. I made 2 copies at the FedEx office, one for Evan, one for Kaia. Separate envelopes, separate tracking numbers. I wanted them each to receive their own copy, to have their own private moment of realization that something had shifted, that their assumptions might no longer be valid. Then I handwrote 2 identical notes on plain cardstock, my handwriting deliberately neat and emotionless. Under review. Further updates when decisions are finalized. Rebecca. No explanation. No emotion. No room for argument or negotiation. I mailed them both priority overnight. They'd arrive tomorrow, December 30th, while I was here in Phoenix, unreachable and unbothered. The postal clerk scanned the envelopes and handed me the receipts. Big day for mailing, she said cheerfully. You could say that, I replied. I felt lighter walking back to the car. Not vindictive. Not triumphant. Just clear. This wasn't revenge. Revenge would require anger, and I'd moved past anger into something colder and more useful, strategy. I wasn't punishing them. I was reminding them, and myself, that my life, my assets, my legacy were mine to control. That their access to any of it was a privilege, not a right. That I could revoke that privilege as easily as I'd granted it. I didn't need to scream or cry or confront. I just needed to act. And I had. Back at the casita, I opened my notebook, the one with the original list of sacrifices I'd made that first night in the hotel, and started a new inventory. Not just what I'd given, but what it had cost me. This was harder. More painful. Because it meant calculating not just in dollars and hours, but in dignity. In self-worth. In the parts of myself I'd slowly erased to make room for their needs. Babysitting during Hawaii trip, June 2019. 2 weeks of vacation days I'll never get back. $0 payment received. Acknowledgement, we're back, text. Actual cost, 14 days, approximately 112 waking hours. Emotional cost, realizing they never asked if I had plans. Just assumed I'd be available. Car insurance premium, November 2020. $847 paid. Promise of repayment, as soon as we get our tax refund. Actual repayment, $0. Follow-up when I mentioned it 6 months later, Evan got defensive. I thought we settled that. Emotional cost, learning that asking to be paid back made me the bad guy. Down payment assistance, spring 2018. $15,000 from the investment account Robert built. Verbal agreement, just a loan, Mom, we'll pay you back in a couple years when Kaia makes partner. Actual repayment, $0. What they told their friends, we saved for years and did this all on our own. Emotional cost, discovering I'd been erased from their success story. Wedding gift, 2017. $1,200 China set from their registry. Paid off over 6 months on my credit card. Thank you received, group card that said, thanks for celebrating with us, with my name misspelled. Times the China has been used when I've visited, 0. Emotional cost, understanding that my financial sacrifice meant nothing to them. The list went on. Page after page. 7 years of invisible labor, financial support, emotional energy poured into a relationship that only flowed one direction. I wasn't itemizing this to send to them. I wasn't building a case or preparing for confrontation. I was doing it for me. To prove to myself that I hadn't imagined the imbalance. That my feelings were valid. That the ledger of invisible labor I'd been keeping in my head was real and documented and undeniable. Every time I'd wondered if I was being too sensitive, too demanding, too much, here was the evidence. Concrete. Measurable. Impossible to dismiss. I'd given everything. They'd taken it and asked for more. By the time I finished, it was late afternoon. My hand cramped from writing. The notebook was nearly full, pages and pages of catalogued sacrifice, each entry a small wound I'd been carrying for years. I made tea, something I never did at home because there was never time, and sat on the patio, watching the last light fade from the mountains. The roadrunner was back, stalking through the desert scrub with single-minded focus. It moved deliberately, pausing occasionally to tilt its head and listen, then darting forward with sudden precision. It didn't second-guess itself. Didn't apologize for its nature. Just hunted, with clarity and purpose. I wanted to be like that. Clear. Purposeful. Unapologetic. For 7 years, I'd measured my worth by whether Evan and Kaia valued me. Whether they called. Whether they said thank you. Whether they included me in their lives beyond what was convenient for them. And every time they didn't, every ignored gift, every forgotten favor, every casual dismissal, I'd internalized it. Believed it meant something about me. That I wasn't doing enough, giving enough, being enough. But sitting there in the cooling desert air, with my notebook full of proof and my phone still blissfully silent, I understood something I should have understood years ago. Their failure to see my value didn't diminish it. It just revealed their inability to recognize it. I wasn't worthless because they treated me as disposable. They were ungrateful because they'd never learned to appreciate what they had. And I didn't need to keep teaching them lessons they clearly had no interest in learning. That night, I revised my emergency contact list. It was a small thing, administratively speaking. Just logging into my bank accounts, my insurance policies, my medical records, and updating the, in case of emergency, fields. Evan's name had been there for 16 years. Primary contact. The person they'd call if something happened to me. The person who'd make decisions if I couldn't. I deleted it. In its place, I added Lainey Torres, my goddaughter, technically, though I'd always thought of her as the daughter I never had. Lainey, who called me every few weeks just to talk. Who sent me pictures of her garden and asked for my pot roast recipe and remembered my birthday without Facebook reminding her. Lainey, who had thanked me profusely when I'd sent her $500 for her graduate school textbooks 3 years ago. Who'd written me an actual letter, handwritten, on real stationery, explaining how much it meant to her, how it had allowed her to focus on her studies instead of taking extra shifts at the campus bookstore. Lainey, who saw me. Who valued me. Who treated my presence in her life like a gift instead of a service. If something happened to me, I wanted the hospital to call someone who'd actually care. I updated each account methodically. Bank. Insurance. Doctor's office. Credit cards. One by one, I erased Evan from the administrative machinery of my life and replaced him with someone who'd earned the privilege. It took an hour. When I finished, I felt simultaneously lighter and heavier. Lighter because I'd taken action. Heavier because I understood what that action meant. I was preparing for a life where my son was no longer at the center. The redacted trusts would arrive tomorrow. I imagined Kaia opening hers first. She was always home during the day, always the one who collected the mail. I imagined her confusion, then irritation, then that calculation I'd seen in her eyes so many times before. She'd call Evan. He'd call me. The phone would ring, and I wouldn't answer. They'd text. Email. Maybe even call Maria, if they could figure out where I was, though I doubted they'd try that hard. And eventually, days, maybe weeks from now, they'd realize what I'd known for years. I didn't owe them my presence. My money. My time. My life. I'd given those things freely, out of love and hope and a desperate desire to matter to them. But love isn't supposed to be desperate. And hope shouldn't require self-erasure. I closed the notebook and put it away in the drawer by the bed. Tomorrow, I'd contact the attorney, Robert's friend, the one who'd handled all our estate planning. I'd schedule a consultation. Start the process of actually making changes instead of just contemplating them. But tonight, I just sat in the gathering darkness and breathed. No one was demanding anything from me. No one was keeping score of what I owed them. No one was treating my existence as an inconvenience to be managed. For the first time in 7 years, I was invisible by choice instead of by dismissal. And the difference felt like freedom. The attorney's office was in Old Town Scottsdale, tucked between a gallery selling turquoise jewelry and a cafe that advertised authentic Southwest fusion. I arrived 15 minutes early and sat in my car, watching tourists wander past in their vacation clothes, carefree and unburdened. I'd called Gerald Hoffman 3 days ago, the same attorney who'd handled Robert's estate and updated my will after Evan's wedding. He'd sounded surprised to hear from me, but pleasantly so, the way people sound when an old acquaintance resurfaces unexpectedly. Rebecca. It's been years. What can I do for you? I need to revise my estate documents, I'd said simply. All of them. There'd been a pause. Not judgmental, just careful. Of course. Let me check my calendar. Now I was here, clutching the peace binder against my chest like armor, ready to undo what I'd signed 7 years ago when I'd still believed that family meant something mutual. Gerald's office was exactly as I remembered it, warm wood paneling, leather chairs, shelves lined with legal volumes that probably hadn't been opened in decades. He stood when I entered, extending his hand with a smile that reached his eyes. Rebecca. You look well. It was a polite lie, I probably looked exhausted, but I appreciated it anyway. Thank you for seeing me on short notice. Of course. He gestured to one of the leather chairs. Now, tell me what you're thinking. I sat, placed the peace binder on his desk, and opened it to the trust documents. The ones with Evan and Kaia's names. The ones I'd been staring at for days, feeling the weight of that old decision pressing down on me. I want them removed, I said quietly. Both of them. Completely. Gerald's expression didn't change, but I saw his eyes sharpen slightly. He pulled the documents closer, scanning the pages with practiced efficiency. This is a significant change, he said carefully. May I ask what's prompted this? I'd prepared for this question. Had rehearsed several versions of my answer, ranging from vague, "We've had a falling out," to brutally honest, "They treat me like hired help and I'm done subsidizing my own erasure." What came out was somewhere in between. They don't value me, I said. Not as a person. Not as family. Just as a resource. And I'm not leaving my life's work to people who can't be bothered to treat me with basic respect. Gerald nodded slowly. He'd been Robert's friend before he was our attorney. He'd been at our wedding, at Evan's christening, at Robert's funeral. He knew our family. Knew what we'd been. I understand, he said simply. And I'm sorry. Those 3 words, "I'm sorry," hit harder than I expected. Because they acknowledged something I'd been afraid to name, that what had happened to me was wrong. That I wasn't being dramatic or oversensitive or difficult. I was being mistreated. And someone finally saw it. I blinked back the heat behind my eyes and straightened in my chair. I want to name my goddaughter, Lainey Torres, as the primary beneficiary. For everything. Gerald made a note. Lainey Torres. Do you have her full legal name and contact information? I did. I'd prepared a folder with everything he'd need, Lainey's information, updated valuations of my assets, a list of specific bequests I wanted to make. I'd spent the past 3 days organizing it all, channeling my emotions into spreadsheets and documentation. Gerald reviewed the materials, asking occasional clarifying questions. His tone was professional, detached in the way attorneys need to be, but I caught something else underneath: approval, maybe, or respect. What about specific exclusions? He asked. Do you want language that explicitly names Evan and Kaia as non-beneficiaries? I considered this. The vindictive part of me, the part that was still raw from Christmas Eve, wanted their names right there in black and white. These people are specifically excluded because they are assholes. But the clearer part of me, the part that had been growing stronger every day in Phoenix, knew better. No, I said. I don't want to give them that much space in the document. I want a clause that says beneficiaries must be individuals who maintain active, respectful relationships with me. Something that makes it about values, not names. Gerald smiled, a small, genuine smile. I can draft that language. It's actually more legally sound than a specific exclusion. Harder to contest. Contest. I hadn't even thought about that. The possibility that Evan might fight this, might claim I was mentally incompetent or unduly influenced or whatever legal terms entitled children used when their inheritance disappeared. Can he challenge this? I asked. He can try, Gerald said frankly. Anyone can contest a will or trust. But if we document your competency, your clear intentions, and your reasoning, without making it about personal vendettas, it becomes much harder to overturn. Especially if you're explicit that this is about relationship quality, not punishment. I nodded. That's what I wanted anyway. Not revenge. Just boundaries. Just the simple assertion that my resources would only go to people who treated me like a human being. How long will this take? I asked. I can have draft documents ready in a week. We'll need to review them together, make any adjustments, then schedule a signing with witnesses and a notary. 2 weeks, maybe 3 for everything to be finalized. 2 weeks. In 2 weeks, I could undo 7 years of assumed entitlement. In 2 weeks, I could reclaim my legacy. Let's do it, I said. Gerald walked me through the process step by step. We'd revise the trust first, then update my will to match. He'd include specific language about relationship requirements, mental competency affirmations, and a clause stating that I'd made these changes freely and with full understanding of their implications. I'll also recommend we include a video deposition, he said. You stating your intentions clearly, in your own words. It's not required, but it makes contestation much more difficult. The idea of sitting in front of a camera and explaining why I was disinheriting my only child made my stomach turn. But I understood the necessity. Okay, I said. Whatever makes this ironclad. We scheduled a follow-up appointment for the following week. Gerald stood and shook my hand again, his grip firm and reassuring. You're doing the right thing, Rebecca, he said quietly. I know it doesn't feel like it right now, but you are. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Walking out of his office into the bright Scottsdale sunshine, I felt simultaneously emptied and filled. Like I'd drained an infected wound and the pain was less, even if the healing would take time. I sat in my car for a long moment before starting the engine. My phone, which I'd started keeping on during the day, though I still ignored most calls, buzzed with a text notification. Evan. The fourth one this week. Mom, this is getting ridiculous. Whatever we did, we're sorry. Can we please just talk? I stared at the message. Whatever we did. Not, I'm sorry for not defending you. Not, I'm sorry Kaia was cruel. Just a vague, non-specific apology that didn't acknowledge anything real. And that we're sorry, speaking for Kaia, as if her remorse was something he could vouch for. As if this was a unified front instead of what it actually was, him trying to smooth things over so his life could return to its comfortable equilibrium. I deleted the message without responding and drove back to the casita. That evening, I tackled the box. It had arrived 4 days ago, forwarded from my home address to Maria's house. She'd knocked on the casita door with an apologetic smile, holding a medium-sized cardboard box with Kaia's return address label. I'd thanked her and set it inside, unopened, waiting for the right moment. This was the moment. I used kitchen scissors to cut through the packing tape and folded back the flaps. Inside, carefully wrapped in tissue paper that probably cost more than its contents, were the artifacts of my invisible labor. The pie plate, cream-colored ceramic with a scalloped edge, the one I'd use for every Thanksgiving, every Christmas, every family gathering for 30 years. The one Kaia had borrowed 2 years ago, for a work potluck, and never returned until now. A baby quilt I'd sewn when Kaia was pregnant with their first child. Soft cotton in yellows and greens, hand-stitched with tiny ducks. I'd spent 6 weeks on it, working late into the night after grading papers, making every stitch perfect. A photograph in a drugstore frame, Evan and me at his college graduation. Both of us beaming, my arm around his shoulders, his whole future ahead of him. Before Kaia. Before the house. Before everything got complicated. No note. No explanation. Just my things, returned like items from a storage unit. I lifted the quilt first, running my fingers over the stitching I remembered making. The ducks I'd chosen because Evan had loved ducks as a child. The colors I'd selected to be gender neutral because Kaia hadn't wanted to know the baby's sex. 12 years of careful preservation, and she was sending it back. I understood what it meant. This meant nothing to me. It was always just stuff. I folded the quilt carefully and placed it in a canvas bag. Tomorrow, I'd take it to a donation center. Some child somewhere would sleep under it, wrapped in warmth I'd created. Someone who didn't know me but who'd benefit from my labor anyway. That felt right. Better than it sitting in Kaia's linen closet, unused and unvalued. The pie plate I wrapped in newspaper and tucked into the top shelf of the casita's single closet. I might want it someday. Might bake a pie just for myself, reclaiming that small domestic pleasure. Or I might not. Either way, it was mine now. The photograph, though, that I kept out. I set it on the wooden table and stared at it for a long time. Evan at 22, his whole life unwritten. Me at 47, still raw from Robert's death but fighting through it, so proud of my boy. We'd been happy that day. Really happy. Before mortgages and marriages and the slow erosion of everything we'd been to each other. I didn't cry looking at it. I just remembered. Let myself grieve not for who Evan was now, but for who we'd both been then. Then I tucked the photo into my purse. A reminder. Not of what I'd lost, but of who I'd been before I learned to shrink. 2 weeks later, I sat in Gerald's conference room with 2 witnesses I'd never met and a notary who seemed bored by the whole proceeding. The revised trust documents were spread before me. 46 pages of legal language that boiled down to something beautifully simple. Everything I had would go to someone who valued me. Gerald walked me through each page, each clause, each specific bequest. I'd left small amounts to charities Robert and I had supported. A meaningful sum to Lainey. Clear instructions for my funeral, simple, no fuss, donations to the local food bank instead of flowers. And the relationship clause, worded perfectly. Beneficiaries must maintain active, respectful, and mutually supportive relationships with the grantor. The trustee shall have full discretion to determine whether this standard has been met. No names. No accusations. Just boundaries. Any questions before we proceed? Gerald asked. I looked at the signature lines. Thought about Evan and Kaia receiving redacted copies 2 weeks ago. Thought about the unopened voicemails still clogging my phone. Thought about Christmas Eve and the dish towel and the moment I'd finally had enough. No, I said. No questions. I signed each page where indicated. The witnesses signed. The notary stamped and dated and added her seal. When it was done, Gerald smiled and extended his hand. Congratulations, Rebecca. Your affairs are in order. No ambiguity, I said quietly, more to myself than to him. Not this time. Not this time, he agreed. I walked out of that office a different woman than I'd been walking in. Not because I'd punished anyone. Not because I'd won some battle. But because I'd finally, definitively, claimed ownership of my own life. The rest was just paperwork. The mornings in Phoenix became my favorite time. Not because anything dramatic happened, quite the opposite. It was the absolute absence of drama that made them precious. I'd wake naturally, without an alarm, sometime around 7 when the lights started filtering through the thin curtains of the casita. I'd make coffee in the small French press I'd bought at a thrift store, pour it into the mug Maria had left behind, and carry it outside to the patio. Then I'd sit. Just sit. No agenda. No errands that couldn't wait. No one texting me at 6 a.m. asking if I could do them a huge favor. Just me, the coffee, and the slow creep of sunlight across the Superstition Mountains. It had been 3 weeks since I'd signed the revised trust documents. 3 weeks since I'd walked out of Gerald's office feeling simultaneously lighter and more solid, like I'd shed weight I didn't know I'd been carrying while simultaneously finding my footing on ground that had always been there. The phone calls from Evan had stopped after the first week. I'd never answered them, never responded to the voicemails that progressed from confused, "Mom, what's going on?" to irritated, "This is childish, you need to communicate," to vaguely threatening, "If you don't call me back, I'm going to assume something's wrong and contact the police." He hadn't contacted the police. Of course he hadn't. That would have required actual effort, actual concern. It was easier to be annoyed, to tell himself I was being difficult, to eventually just stop trying. The silence that followed felt like a gift. I'd started reading again. Not articles on my phone or snippets between obligations, but actual books. Novels I'd been meaning to read for years, the kind that required attention and time and the luxury of getting lost in someone else's story for a while. The first one I finished was a mystery set in Cornwall, all moody cliffs and secrets buried in small villages. I'd bought it at a used bookstore in Tempe, drawn to the cover art and the author's name I vaguely recognized from some recommendation list I'd saved years ago. I read it on the patio over the course of 4 days, savoring each chapter, letting the story unspool at its own pace. When I finished, I sat there for a long time with the closed book in my lap, marveling at the simple fact that I'd done something purely for my own enjoyment. No one had needed me. No one had interrupted. I'd spent 4 days reading a book, and the world hadn't ended. It felt revolutionary. On a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks and 2 days after Christmas Eve, I opened my journal and wrote the sentence that had been forming in my mind for days. I didn't abandon them. I stopped paying to stay. I stared at the words, pen hovering above the page, waiting to see if they'd spark guilt or regret or that familiar anxiety that maybe I was being too harsh, too unforgiving, too much. Nothing came. Just clarity. Because it was true. I hadn't abandoned my son. I'd simply stopped funding my own erasure. Stopped paying, in time, money, emotional labor, self-respect, for the privilege of being treated as an afterthought. I wrote more, letting the thoughts flow faster than I could organize them. For 7 years, I convinced myself that love meant sacrifice. That being a good mother meant being available, accommodating, uncomplaining. That if I just gave enough, they'd eventually see my value. But love isn't supposed to be a hostage negotiation. You shouldn't have to prove your worth to people who claim to care about you. I didn't fail them. They failed me. And I don't have to keep pretending otherwise. Leaving wasn't the end of our relationship. It was the end of my participation in my own diminishment. I filled 3 pages, the handwriting getting messier as I went, emotions pouring out that I'd been carefully managing for weeks. Anger, yes, but also grief. Sadness for what I'd hoped we'd be, what I'd believed we were. And underneath it all, something unexpected, relief. Relief that I'd finally stopped performing. Stopped contorting myself to fit into spaces where I wasn't wanted. Stopped believing that my value as a person was contingent on someone else's willingness to acknowledge it. When I finished, my hand was cramping and my coffee had gone cold. But I felt clearer than I had in years. Like I'd been wearing glasses with the wrong prescription and had finally gotten them adjusted. The world looked different now. Sharper. More honest. That afternoon, I drove to a hiking trail Maria had recommended, a relatively easy loop through the desert with views of the city. I'd never been much of a hiker, but I was trying new things now. Reclaiming hobbies and interests I'd set aside when they didn't fit into the narrow role I'd been assigned. The trail was moderately crowded with retirees and young families, everyone moving at their own pace. I walked slowly, stopping frequently to examine the cacti and wildflowers, the jackrabbits that scattered at my approach. Halfway through, I found a flat rock in the shade and sat, pulling out the water bottle I'd remembered to bring. Around me, the desert was alive in ways I'd never noticed before, birds calling, insects humming, the wind moving through the brittle bush. My phone stayed in my pocket. Silent. Ignored. No one knew where I was. No one was expecting me anywhere. And that felt not lonely, but liberated. I thought about Kaia and Evan, probably going about their lives with the mild irritation of people whose convenience had been disrupted. Maybe they'd adjusted by now, found someone else to call when they needed last-minute childcare or financial backup. Maybe they told their friends some version of the story where I was the difficult one, the unreasonable mother who'd overreacted to nothing. It didn't matter. Their narrative about me didn't define my reality anymore. I finished my water, tucked the bottle back in my pack, and continued the loop. By the time I reached my car, my legs were tired and my face was flushed from the sun, and I felt more alive than I had in years. Dinner that night was simple, pasta with olive oil and garlic, a salad from the farmer's market, a glass of wine I'd bought because I liked the label. I ate slowly, sitting at the small table, reading more of the second book I'd started, a memoir about a woman who'd hiked the Appalachian Trail at 65. No one joined me. No one asked what I was making or complained about the menu or suggested we order takeout instead. Just me, my book, my simple meal. It was perfect. After dinner, I washed my single plate, my single fork, my single wine glass. The dish towel, a plain cotton one I'd bought at Target, hung neatly on the oven handle. No symbolism. No lingering trauma. Just a towel. I poured a second glass of wine and returned to the patio, watching the sun set behind the mountains. The sky turned amber, then pink, then deep purple. Stars began to appear, more than I'd ever seen at home where light pollution washed them out. My phone buzzed once, a notification from my bank about a processed payment. I glanced at it, then set it face down on the table. No missed calls. No urgent texts. No one needed me. And I didn't need them to need me anymore. That night, I made a final entry in my journal. Not a long one. Just a simple statement of fact. Day 24 in Phoenix. First day I didn't think about them at all. It wasn't entirely true. I'd thought about them briefly during my hike, and again while washing dishes. But it was close enough to true. Close enough to mark a shift. They were no longer the center of my emotional universe. They were people I used to organize my life around, and now I didn't. I thought about the trust documents, safely filed in Gerald's office. About Lainey, who'd called last week just to tell me about a hummingbird she'd seen in her garden, no agenda, no favors requested. About the quilt I'd donated, now warming some child I'd never meet. I thought about the pie plates stored in my closet, waiting. About the photo of Evan and me at graduation, tucked in my purse, a reminder not of what we'd become, but of who I'd been before I learned to shrink. I was getting her back. That woman who'd raised a child alone, who'd worked double shifts and paid off mortgages and survived widowhood with her dignity intact. The woman who'd somehow forgotten, over 7 years of slow erosion, that her worth wasn't up for debate. She'd been there all along, underneath the performance. I just needed to remember her. The weeks that followed developed a rhythm. Morning coffee. Reading. Occasional hikes. Long phone calls with Lainey, who never once asked where I'd been or why I'd left, just told me she was glad I sounded happy. I started volunteering at a local literacy center, tutoring adults learning to read. It felt good to use my teaching skills again, to see genuine appreciation in students' eyes when something clicked. I joined a book club at the library, 8 women ranging from their 50s to their 80s, all opinionated and smart and refreshingly direct. They welcomed me without prying, made space for me without demands. I wasn't hiding. I wasn't running. I was just living. On my terms. In my time. For myself. Sometimes, late at night, I wondered if Evan would ever understand. If someday he'd realize what he'd lost, what Kaia had cost him. If he'd call with a real apology, not a performative one designed to smooth things over. Maybe he would. Maybe he wouldn't. Either way, I was done waiting for him to see me. I saw myself. And that was enough. 3 months after Christmas Eve, I sat on my patio with morning coffee and opened an email from Gerald. Rebecca. Just wanted to confirm that all revised documents have been filed and your estate plan is complete. Everything is in order. Let me know if you need anything else. Best, Gerald. I read it twice, then deleted it. Not because it wasn't important, but because it was done. Finished. No longer requiring my attention or emotional energy. I set down my phone and picked up my coffee, watching the roadrunner that had become a regular visitor hunt through the gravel. It paused, cocked its head, then darted forward with absolute certainty. No second guessing. No apology for taking up space. Just clear, purposeful action. I raised my mug in a silent toast to the bird, to myself, to everyone who'd ever had to learn the hard way that you can't shrink yourself small enough to fit into places where you were never truly welcome. The coffee was good. The morning was quiet. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, I had absolutely nothing to prove. I'd been indispensable, invisible, misused. Now I was just Rebecca. And Rebecca was enough. The phone stayed silent. The world demanded nothing. And I sat in the Phoenix sunshine, free. Not because I'd won some battle or proven some point. But because I'd finally, completely, stopped paying to stay. And liberation, I'd learned, doesn't announce itself with trumpets or declarations. It just feels like finally being able to breathe.